The morning of May 7, 2025 dawned with a steely resolve in India. The nation was still reeling from the horrific attack on tourists in Indian-administered Kashmir in April. The blame lay squarely on Pakistan-backed militants, a truth that seared through India's conscience. This act of terror would not go unanswered. India would act, and act decisively. It did. In the pre-dawn hours, the Indian Air Force launched Operation Synindor, a series of precision missile strikes targeting terrorist infrastructure deep inside Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Operation Synindor was not merely a military operation, it was a statement. It was a statement that India would no longer tolerate the use of its neighbors' territory as a launchpad for terror. The strikes were swift, unexpected, and sent shockwaves across the region and the world. This was not a war, India maintained, but a necessary act of self-defense against those who sought to bleed India with 1,000 cuts. The operation, shrouded in secrecy until the first explosions were reported, caught many by surprise. The targets were carefully chosen, locations linked to groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, the very outfits responsible for the April attack. These were not random acts of aggression but calculated strikes aimed at dismantling the infrastructure of terror that threatened India's peace and security. The world watched, holding its breath, as India took matters into its own hands. The operation, audacious in its planning and execution, marked a turning point in India's fight against terrorism. It was a clear message: India would no longer be a silent victim, it would fight back and fight back hard. Operation Synindor was not a scattergun approach, but a carefully calibrated operation aimed at crippling the operational capabilities of terrorist groups. Intelligence agencies had painstakingly identified 9 key locations that served as training camps, logistical hubs, and communication centers for these organizations. One of the primary targets was a mosque in Bahawalpur, suspected to be a front for Jaish-e-Mohammed activities. This group, known for its brazen attacks on Indian soil, had long been a thorn in India's side. Other sites near Muzaffarabad, Muridke, and Kotli, known hideouts for Lashkar-e-Taiba, were also targeted. The strikes were intended to dismantle the networks that provided these groups with manpower, training, and resources. The choice of targets highlighted India's resolve to go after the very nerve centers of these terrorist organizations. These were not mere symbolic strikes but aimed at disrupting their ability to plan and execute further attacks. The message was clear. India was determined to degrade their capabilities and cripple their operations. The strikes were met with conflicting reports of casualties. India maintained that its strikes were precise and targeted only terrorist infrastructure, minimizing civilian casualties. Pakistan, however, painted a different picture, claiming a higher death toll, including civilians. The fog of war, as always, made it difficult to ascertain the true extent of the damage and loss of life. Pakistan's response to Operation Synindor was swift and predictable. Denying the existence of terrorist camps within its borders, Pakistan decried the strikes as an act of aggression and a violation of its sovereignty. The Pakistani military went into high alert, vowing a befitting response to the Indian provocation. Adding fuel to the fire, Pakistan claimed to have shot down 2 Indian fighter jets that allegedly strayed into its airspace during the operation. India, however, denied losing any aircraft, asserting that all its jets returned safely to base after carrying out their mission. The conflicting claims and counterclaims further escalated tensions between the 2 nuclear-armed neighbors. Pakistan's response was not limited to rhetoric. In a tit-for-tat move, Pakistani forces launched retaliatory strikes into Indian-administered Kashmir. These strikes, targeting civilian areas, resulted in casualties, further escalating the conflict. Pakistan's Prime Minister, in a televised address, declared a state of emergency in Punjab province, vowing to defend his country's sovereignty at all costs. The situation remained volatile, with both sides accusing each other of aggression and warmongering. The world watched with bated breath, hoping that cooler heads would prevail and prevent the situation from spiraling into a full-blown conflict. The international community reacted to Operation Synindor with a mixture of concern and apprehension. The United Nations called for maximum restraint from both India and Pakistan, urging them to engage in dialogue to de-escalate the situation. The United States, while acknowledging India's right to self-defense, urged both sides to exercise caution and avoid further escalation. World leaders engaged in frantic diplomacy, trying to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. The specter of a conflict between 2 nuclear-armed nations was a nightmare scenario that the world could ill afford. The stakes were high, and the consequences of miscalculation were too dire to contemplate. The conflict also had immediate repercussions beyond the battlefield. Airspace closures in both countries led to widespread flight cancellations, disrupting travel plans for thousands. Schools in the border regions were closed indefinitely, and markets experienced fluctuations as anxieties ran high. The conflict had cast a long shadow, impacting the lives of ordinary citizens on both sides of the border. Operation Synindor was not an isolated incident but the latest chapter in the long and troubled history of Indo-Pak relations. The two nations, born out of the bloody partition of British India, have fought 3 wars since 1947, 2 of them over the disputed territory of Kashmir. The unresolved Kashmir issue has been a festering wound, poisoning relations between the two neighbors for decades. The events of May 7, 2025, serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the region. The path ahead remains fraught with danger, and it remains to be seen whether India and Pakistan can find a way to coexist peacefully, or whether they are condemned to remain locked in an endless cycle of hostility and violence.